The galaxy had known peace for 12,000 years. Not the peace of equals, but the peace of masters who had forgotten what challenge felt like. At the heart of known space, 17 species sat upon thrones they have built from the bones of time itself. They called themselves the Covenant of Eternal Minds, and they had earned that name through one simple truth: they could not die. The Zelthrani were beings of pure thought, their consciousness stored in crystals that floated through the void. They had existed for 900,000 years, watching stars born and die while they remained unchanged. The Varath were predators who had learned to steal life from others, feeding on the neural energy of lesser species to fuel their endless existence. The Kroner existed in loops of time, dying and being reborn in the same moment forever. Each of the 17 species had found their own path to immortality, and each believed this made them gods. They ruled the galaxy not through war, but through simple patience. When a new species rose to challenge them, the Covenant simply waited. 1,000 years. 10,000 years. Eventually, the challengers grew old and died, their civilizations crumbling to dust while the Covenant remained. This was the natural order of things. The eternal would always triumph over the temporary. Then humanity arrived. The first human ships appeared at the edge of Covenant space 300 years ago. They were crude things held together by metal and hope, carrying creatures that lived for less than a century. The Covenant watched with mild interest as these mortals spread across a small cluster of stars. They built colonies. They had children. They died. Their children had children. They died too. The cycle continued, fast and strange and ultimately meaningless. High Ascendant Vorix of the Zelthrani found them amusing. He had watched species like this before, brief sparks that flared and faded. In his 900,000 years, he had seen 10,000 such species rise and fall. Humanity would be no different. They were made of meat and blood and bone, things that rotted and failed. They were temporary. They were nothing. Ambassador Yar Chun did not feel like nothing as she stood before the Covenant Council. She was 63 years old, which meant she had perhaps 20 years left if she was lucky. Her hair had turned gray, and her joints ached in the morning. By the standards of the beings before her, she was already dying. But her eyes were sharp, and her voice was steady. The United Human Colonies formally request expanded settlement rights in the Outer Reach, she said. The region is unclaimed and would support 12 billion of our people. The council chamber was vast, a sphere of crystal that floated in empty space. Representatives of the 17 immortal species surrounded her, their forms strange and ancient. Some had bodies. Some were light. Some existed in ways human minds could not fully understand. All of them looked at her with the same expression, boredom mixed with faint contempt. High Ascendant Vorix drifted forward, his crystalline form catching the light of distant stars. When he spoke, his voice resonated through dimensions that humans could barely perceive. The Outer Reach, he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, is reserved for future Covenant expansion. We placed that claim 40,000 years ago. With respect, Yara replied, the Covenant has not touched that region in 40,000 years. Our people need room to grow. We are asking only for what you do not use. Vorix made a sound that might have been laughter. It echoed strangely, bouncing off walls that existed only partially in normal space. Around him, other council members shifted with amusement. The Vorath representative, a towering creature of shadow and hunger named Kethvorax, showed teeth that had tasted the essence of 1,000 species. What you need is irrelevant, Vorix said. You are mortals. Your needs are temporary. In 1,000 years, your entire species will be dust and memory. Why should we change the shape of the galaxy to accommodate creatures who will not live to see it? Yara felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She had trained for this. She had known what she would face. Humanity had been dealing with the Covenant's contempt for 3 centuries now. "We may be mortal," she said, "but we are here now. We contribute to the galactic community. We trade. We build. We create. Surely that has value." "You contribute nothing we cannot do ourselves," another voice said. This was Eternal Mother Thesix of the Vorth, her form rippling with stolen life energy. "You build things that will crumble. You create children who will die. Everything you do is temporary. Everything you are is temporary. You are not even insects to us, Ambassador. You are the brief dreams of insects." The council chamber filled with sounds of agreement. 900,000 years of arrogance pressed down on Yara-chan like a physical weight. She was one woman, one mortal woman, standing before beings who had watched galaxies form. And they saw her as nothing. But Yara had something the Covenant had forgotten. She had a deadline. Every human did. And deadlines made you focus on what really mattered. "Then, we will withdraw our request," she said quietly. "For now." "A wise choice," Vorik said. "Return when your species learns permanence. If you survive that long." More laughter. More contempt. Yara turned and walked from the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Behind her, the Covenant returned to their endless discussions of matters that would take millennia to resolve. They had already forgotten her. She was mortal. She did not matter. In her ship, traveling back to human space, Yara sat alone and looked at the stars. She thought about her grandmother, who had died when Yara was young. She thought about her daughter, who was raising children of her own now. She thought about all the generations of humans who had lived and died, and passed on something to those who came after. The Covenant saw mortality as weakness. They saw the brief human lifespan as proof of inferiority. But Yara knew something they had forgotten. She knew what it meant to have limited time. She knew the fire that burned in creatures who understood that every moment was precious because it would not come again. The immortals had forever. But forever had made them slow. It had made them careless. It had made them forget what it felt like to truly live. Yara-chan made a note in her personal log. Words that would later be found by historians searching for the beginning of what came next. "They do not see us as a threat," she wrote. "They see us as beneath notice. They have made the worst mistake any enemy can make. They have underestimated creatures who have nothing to lose." She did not know what was coming. None of them did. But somewhere in the cold equations of galactic politics, a timer had started. And humanity, for all its brief and burning existence, was very good with deadlines. New Helsinki was a beautiful world. It had blue oceans and green forests and cities that climbed toward the sky like silver fingers reaching for the stars. 17 million humans called it home. They had farms and schools and hospitals. They had families. They had lives that were short by galactic standards, but full of meaning. The Vorth came on a Tuesday. Morning. Their ships appeared without warning. Dark shapes that blocked out the sun. The Vorth Dominion had not hunted new prey in 6,000 years. The galaxy had learned to fear them long ago, and that fear had kept them fed. But fear grows stale over time. The Vorth were hungry for something fresh. Something that would remind them of the old days when they had been the terror of the stars. Humanity. They decided would serve this purpose nicely. The first attacks hit the orbital defense stations. Human weapons fired back, but the Vorth technology was ancient and powerful. Shields that had stopped plasma for 2 million years absorbed everything the humans threw at them. The stations fell one by one, and the Vorth descended to the surface like a plague. Commander Eric Johansson was 42 years old. He had a wife named Maria and 2 children, ages 8 and 12. When the Vorth landed, He knew he would never see his family again. He knew this because he understood what the Varath were. They did not come to conquer. They came to feed. He gathered his soldiers and gave them a simple order: make them pay for every step. The Varath expected what they always found when they attacked mortal species. They expected panic. They expected surrender. They expected prey that would run and hide and beg for mercy that would never come. They had fed on hundreds of species this way. The pattern never changed, but humanity had never read that pattern. In the capital city, a schoolteacher named Anna Lindgren saw Varath warriors approaching her building. Inside were 200 children, hiding in the basement, trying not to cry. Anna was 35 years old. She had never held a weapon in her life. She picked up a piece of broken metal from the street and stood in the doorway. She died in seconds. But the Varath who killed her felt something strange, something they had not experienced in ages: confusion. This creature had known it could not win. It had known it would die. And it had fought anyway. Across the city, across the planet, this scene repeated itself. Parents shielded children with bodies that could not regenerate. Soldiers fought with weapons that could barely scratch Varath armor. Old men and women picked up whatever they could find and stood their ground. And humans did something else the Varath did not expect. They died on purpose. Sergeant Maya Okanko was 28 years old. She had a brother who had died of cancer when she was young. She had always known that life was fragile, that death could come at any time. When her squad was surrounded by Varath warriors, she made a choice that would have been unthinkable to an immortal being. She activated the reactor in her damaged vehicle. The explosion killed her instantly. It also killed 6 Varath warriors, their immortal bodies torn apart by fire and force. For the first time in millennia, Varath actually died. Not captured, not wounded, dead, gone. Ended. The news spread through the Varath command like a disease. Warriors who had existed for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly faced something they had forgotten was possible. They could be killed. These weak, brief, mortal creatures could actually end them. HFY. The Varath commander watched the battle reports with growing unease. The humans were losing, of course. They had to lose. But they were fighting in ways that made no sense to his ancient mind. They were throwing away their lives not in surrender, but in defiance. Every death was a weapon. By the time the colony fell, the Varath had lost over 300 warriors. 300 immortals who had watched empires rise and fall, who had tasted the essence of countless species, who had believed themselves beyond death. Gone in a single day. The surviving humans were taken for harvesting. Their neural energy would feed the Varath for years to come. But the victory felt hollow. This was not how prey was supposed to behave. This was not how mortals were supposed to die. When word of New Helsinki reached Earth and the other human colonies, the reaction was not what the Covenant expected. There was grief, yes. There was mourning for 17 million lost souls. But beneath the grief was something else. Something hot and bright and terrible. Ambassador Yara Chun requested an emergency session with the Covenant Council. She stood in the same crystal chamber where she had been dismissed before, but something in her had changed. The gray in her hair seemed less like age now and more like steel. The Varath Dominion has committed an act of war against the United Human Colonies, she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made even ancient beings pay attention. We demand justice. We demand reparations. We demand that this never happen again. High Ascendant Vorax looked at her with something that might have been pity. The Varath acted within their rights under Covenant law. They require sustenance, and your species exists within their territory of influence. The matter is unfortunate but closed. Closed? Yara repeated. The strong take from the weak, Eternal Mother Desik said. her Vorath form pulsing with fresh energy. Some of that energy, Yara knew, had been stolen from the children of New Helsinki. This is the natural order. This is how the galaxy has always worked. You are immortal. You exist to serve the eternal. Accept your place. For a long moment, Yara said nothing. She looked around the chamber at the 17 species who had ruled the galaxy for longer than humanity had existed. They were old. They were powerful. They were certain that nothing could touch them. Then she smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "I came here to give you one chance," she said quietly. "One chance to make this right. One chance to show that you are capable of justice. You have refused." She turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. "Remember this moment. Remember that we tried." Vorax made the sound that passed for laughter among the Zelthrani. "What will you do, mortal? You live for less than a century. We have existed for eons. You cannot threaten us." Yara's response was broadcast across every Covenant frequency, recorded and preserved and studied for generations to come. "You have made a mistake you will not live long enough to regret." Then she was gone, her small ship carrying her back to human space. The Covenant returned to their eternal affairs, dismissing her words as the empty threat of a dying species. They did not know that across 100 human worlds, engineers and scientists and soldiers were already working. They did not know that humanity had started building something the immortals could not imagine. They did not know that the countdown had begun. The mortals had declared war. The immortals had not noticed. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. In the years after New Helsinki, humanity changed. The grief remained, but it transformed into something harder, something sharper. Every human colony knew what had happened. Every human child learned the names of the 17 million who had died. And every human scientist, engineer, and soldier asked the same question: how do we make sure this never happens again? The answer came from an unexpected place. Dr. James Adayi was a physicist from Lagos who had spent his career studying the nature of consciousness. He was 61 years old and had perhaps 15 good working years left. By immortal standards, he was already nearly dead. But in those 15 years, he intended to change the galaxy. The immortals had achieved their eternal existence through different means, but James found a common thread running through all of them. Whether it was the Zelthrani's quantum crystal storage, the Vorath's neural harvesting, or the Chronos temporal loops, immortality required an anchor, something that held the consciousness in place across time, something that prevented the natural ending that came to all living things. What if that anchor could be cut? James gathered a team of the brightest minds humanity had to offer. They worked in secret shipyards, hidden in asteroid fields and empty corners of space. They worked 18 hours a day because they knew they did not have time to waste. An immortal scientist might take 1,000 years to solve a problem. James and his team had months. This was humanity's secret weapon. Not technology or resources or numbers. Urgency. Every human knew that death was coming. Every human understood that their time was limited. This knowledge, which the Covenant saw as weakness, was actually the source of humanity's greatest strength. An immortal had forever. So why rush? Why push? Why strive? But a mortal had to make every moment count. A mortal had to focus, to prioritize, to achieve results before the clock ran out. The Covenant had stopped innovating millions of years ago. They had reached a level of technology that satisfied them, and they had stayed there. Why improve weapons when no enemy could threaten you? Why develop new shields when your current shields had never failed? They had grown comfortable in their power, frozen in place by the very immortality that should have given them limitless potential. Humanity had no such luxury. Humanity had to grow or die. In just 18 months. James Adeyemi and his team created the Mortality Engine. The weapon did not kill in the traditional sense. It was far worse. It found the anchors that immortals used to maintain their existence, and it severed them. A Zelthrani hit by the Mortality Engine would find their quantum crystal bonds dissolving, their consciousness scattering into the void. A Varath would feel their stolen life energy draining away, leaving them as empty as the millions they had fed upon. A Croner would find their temporal loop broken, experiencing true death for the first time in their endless existence. It was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of ending. Admiral Yuki Okonkwo took command of the human fleet. She was the niece of Sergeant Maya Okonkwo, who had sacrificed herself at New Helsinki. She was 45 years old, with silver threads in her black hair and scars on her hands from years of combat training. When she looked at the stars, she saw the faces of the dead. The first human strike force appeared at the edge of Varath space on a date that would later be celebrated across the galaxy. 50 ships, small by Covenant standards, carrying crews who knew they might not return. The Varath laughed when they detected the approaching fleet. They had existed for 2 million years. They had conquered species beyond counting. What could 50 mortal ships do against their eternal dominion? Keth Vorax himself led the defense. He commanded 1,000 warships, each one ancient beyond human understanding. He had fought battles when humanity's ancestors were still learning to use fire. He knew war like he knew his own endless existence. The human ships did not run. They did not hide. They flew straight toward the Varath fleet, and they opened fire. The first shots were conventional weapons, easily absorbed by Varath shields. Keth Vorax felt a flicker of contempt. These mortals had learned nothing. They were throwing themselves against a wall they could never break. Then the Mortality Engines activated. Keth Vorax watched in horror as his ships began to die. Not disabled. Not damaged. Dying. The crew screamed as their immortality was stripped away, as they felt for the first time in millions of years the cold approach of true ending. Ships that had survived since before Earth formed went dark and silent, filled with corpses that would never rise again. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Varath had lost 800 ships. Humanity had lost 12. The survivors of the Varath fleet fled, carrying news that would shake the foundations of the galaxy. The mortals had found a way to kill the Eternal. Over the next 6 months, humanity pushed into Varath space. They did not conquer planets or capture resources. They did something far more terrible. They ended the VORA. Every Varath world fell. Every Varath ship was destroyed. Every Varath who refused to surrender experienced the touch of the Mortality Engine and learned what their countless victims had known all along. The terror of oblivion. Near the end, Keth Vorax faced Admiral Okonkwo in the ruins of what had been the Varath homeworld. He was the last of his kind, a creature who had existed since stars were young, reduced to cowering before a woman who would be dead of old age in 30 years. Why? He asked, his voice broken and weak. Why do you fight so hard? You will die anyway. Your lives are so short. What does any of this matter to creatures who will be gone in a moment? Yuki looked at him with something that might have been pity. That's exactly why, she said. We have always known that every moment matters. Every choice has weight. Every life has meaning because it will end. You forgot that. You had forever, and you wasted it. You became monsters because you thought there would be no consequences. She activated the Mortality Engine one final time. There are always consequences, she said, as Keth Vorax began to dissolve. You just took so long to face yours that you forgot they were coming. When the light faded, the Varath Dominion was no more. A species that had terrorized the galaxy for 2 million years had been wiped from existence in less than a year. The mortals had proven that nothing lasts forever, not even the eternal. The Covenant of Eternal Minds met in emergency session for the first time in 8,000 years. The crystal chamber that had witnessed countless calm debates now echoed with something the immortals had not felt in ages. Fear. The Vorath were gone. Not defeated. Not conquered. Extinct. High Ascendant Varks stared at the reports with senses that had perceived the birth of galaxies. The data did not change no matter how many times he reviewed it. A species that had existed for 2 million years, that had terrorized the galaxy since before most stars had formed, had been erased from existence in months. Erased by mortals. By creatures who died of old age. By beings that the Covenant had dismissed as insects. "This is impossible," said Chronarch Velix of the Chronar, his form flickering through temporal echoes. "We have existed since time had meaning. We have watched the rise and fall of 1,000 empires. We cannot be threatened by creatures who measure their lives in decades." "And yet," said a calm voice, "here we are." The 16 remaining immortal species turned to face the projection of Ambassador Yara Chen. She was 70 now. Her hair fully white, her face lined with age. By their standards, she was practically a corpse. But her eyes held a fire that made ancient beings uncomfortable. "The Vorath made a choice," Yara said. "They chose to see us as prey. They chose to murder 17 million of our people for food. They chose to believe that mortality made us weak." She paused, letting her words sink in. "They were wrong." "You have made your point," Vorax said, his crystalline form pulsing with agitation. "The Vorath underestimated you. We will not make the same mistake. Withdraw your fleets, and we will negotiate new terms. Perhaps expanded settlement rights. Perhaps even a seat on the Covenant Council. Surely this is what you want." Yara's laugh was soft and sad. "You still do not understand. This is not about territory. This is not about politics. This is about something your eternal minds have forgotten." She leaned forward. "Actions have consequences. You taught the galaxy that the strong take from the weak. You taught the galaxy that mortal species exist to serve the immortal. You taught the galaxy that justice is only for those who can enforce it." She straightened. "We are going to teach you a different lesson." The Covenant's response was swift and terrible. 14 of the 16 remaining immortal species combined their forces for the first time in recorded history. They assembled a fleet that had conquered a quarter of the galaxy in ages past. Ships that had been old when Earth's sun was young moved toward. Human space in numbers that darkened the stars. They expected the mortals to run. They expected surrender, or at least desperate negotiation. Instead, they found humanity waiting for them at the border. Their small fleet arranged in perfect formation. Admiral Yuki Okonkwo broadcast a single message across all frequencies. "You have chosen war. We accept." The conflict that followed would later be called the Mortality War. It lasted 3 years, which was nothing by immortal standards, but an eternity by human ones. 3 generations of human soldiers fought and died and passed the torch to those who came after. The immortals, who had never known such urgency, struggled to adapt to an enemy who changed strategies faster than they could respond. The Zelthrani fell first. Their quantum consciousness, stored in crystals that had survived for nearly 1,000,000 years, dissolved under the touch of mortality engines refined by human scientists who worked like every day was their last. High Ascendant Vorax, who had once laughed at Ambassador Chen's requests, screamed as his eternal existence came to an end. His final thought was confusion. He had existed for so long. How could it end? How could anything end? The Chronar were next. Their temporal loops, which had protected them from death by resetting their existence again and again, were broken by weapons designed by humans who had spent their brief lives studying the nature of time itself. The Chronar experienced something they had never known, a future that would not include them. One by one, the eternal species faced the same choice: surrender and accept mortality, or fight and face extinction. Some chose to fight, believing to the end that immortals could not truly be defeated by mortals. They learned otherwise. The Thesari, beings of living light, were scattered by weapons that disrupted their photonic bonds. The Kethvax, who had achieved immortality through endless replication, found their copies hunted across the galaxy until none remained. The Viridian Collective, a hive mind that had grown for 3 million years, was fragmented and destroyed in a single month. Not all the immortals chose extinction. Some surrendered. Some begged for mercy. These, humanity treated with a kindness that surprised the galaxy. The mortality engine could be adjusted, Dr. Adaimi explained. It did not have to kill. It could simply remove immortality, leaving a mortal being behind. The immortals who surrendered became mortal. They would age. They would die. They would experience endings. Many of them struggled with this reality. Several took their own lives rather than face a future that would not last forever. But some learned to adapt. Some found something they had lost millions of years ago, meaning that by the end of the 3rd year, the Covenant of Eternal Minds no longer existed. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at a galaxy forever changed. She was 48 years old now, older than she had ever expected to live. The war had cost humanity millions of lives. But they had won. The creatures who had dismissed them as insects, who had slaughtered them for food, who had laughed at their brief existence, were gone or humbled. Her communication officer approached with a message. Admiral, Ambassador Chun would like to speak with you. Yara Chun's projection appeared before her. The ambassador was 73 now, frail but still fierce. Admiral, she said, the remaining immortal species have formally surrendered. They accept our terms. And what are our terms? Yuki asked. Why? Ari smiled. The same lesson we have been teaching since this began. That mortality is not weakness. That finite time has value. That every moment matters because it will not come again. She paused. We are not going to become what they were. We are not going to rule the galaxy as tyrants. But we are going to make sure that no species ever treats another as prey again. Yuki nodded slowly. She thought of her Aunt Maya, who had sacrificed herself at New Helsinki. She thought of the 17 million who had died to feed the Varth. She thought of all the humans who had given their brief lives to bring down an empire of immortals. They forgot what it means to be alive, she said quietly. They had forever, so nothing mattered. We have only moments, so everything matters. Yes, Yara agreed. And in the end, that made all the difference. Outside the viewport, stars burned in the endless dark. Species rose and fell. Empires came and went. But the lesson remained, written in fire across the galaxy. The mortals had won. Not despite their mortality, but because of it. 50 years had passed since the end of the Mortality War. The galaxy was a different place. Now, where the Covenant of Eternal Minds had once ruled, a new organization had taken its place. They called it the Compact of Finite Minds, and it operated on principles that would have seemed insane to the immortals of old. Every species was equal. Every life had value. And every being, no matter how powerful or ancient, would eventually face the end. Ambassador Yara Chun had died peacefully at the age of 91, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were recorded and preserved. We showed them what mortality means. We showed them that endings give life meaning. Remember that. Never forget. Admiral Yuki Okonkwo had retired after the war and spent her final years teaching at the military academy. She died at 72, still sharp and fierce to the end. Her students carried her lessons forward. passing them on to generations who had never known the Covenant's rule. Dr. James Adeyemi, creator of the mortality engine, had lived to see his invention change the galaxy. He died at 79, having spent his final decade working on medical technologies to ease suffering rather than cause it. He believed that humanity should be known for healing, not just destruction. These mortals had shaped the galaxy more in their brief lives than the immortals had in millions of years. And that was perhaps the greatest lesson of all. On the planet that had once been the Zelthrani homeworld, a young woman named Tessira walked through ruins that had stood for 900,000 years. She was Zelthrani herself, or what remained of that species. Her crystalline form still caught the light, but she could feel something her ancestors had not known in ages. Time passing. She would grow old. She would change. She would, eventually, die out at first. This knowledge had terrified her. She had been born after the war, raised by parents who had chosen surrender over extinction. They had struggled to explain mortality to a child who had inherited genetic memories of endless existence. How do you explain endings to a species that had never known them? But Tessira had found her own answers. She had studied human culture, human art, human philosophy. She had learned why these brief creatures created such beautiful things, loved so deeply, fought so hard. They did these things because they knew their time was limited. Every sunrise might be the last. Every embrace might be the final one. This knowledge did not make life worse. It made life precious. She had become a historian, documenting the transition from the old galaxy to the new. Her latest work was a study of the mortality war and its aftermath, and she had traveled to this dead world to find answers to a question that had haunted her species. How did mortals defeat immortals? The answer, she had come to understand, was not the mortality engine. That was just a weapon. The answer was deeper than technology. The immortals had lost because they had forgotten why existence mattered. They had lived forever, and in living forever, they had stopped truly living. They had become frozen, static, dead inside while still drawing breath. Humanity had never had that luxury. Every human knew from childhood that death was coming. Every human faced that darkness and had to find meaning anyway. They built civilizations knowing those civilizations would eventually fall. They raised children knowing they would not live to see their children's children. They created art and music and literature, knowing that the hands that made these things would one day be dust. And somehow, impossibly, this made them stronger. Because they were not trying to avoid death. They were trying to make life matter. Tessira finished her observations and returned to the capital city, a new settlement built on the ruins of the old. Here, species that had once been immortal lived alongside those that had always been mortal. They worked together. They built together. They disagreed and argued and compromised, just like every healthy society had done since the beginning of time. The compact of finite minds was not a perfect government. It had flaws and failures and ongoing struggles. But it had something the Covenant had lacked: growth. It changed. It learned. It became better, generation by generation, because its members knew that future generations would inherit what they built. That evening, Tessira attended a memorial service for the victims of New Helsinki. The event was held every year, drawing beings from across the galaxy. Humans stood beside former immortals, all of them united by a simple truth. Every life mattered because every life ended. A human speaker took the podium, an old woman with kind eyes. She was a descendant of one of the New Helsinki survivors, and her family had kept the memory alive for 50 years. "My great-grandmother survived the Marath attack," she said. "She lost everyone she loved that day. Her parents, her husband, her children, everything. And for the rest of her life, she carried that loss with her." The speaker paused, gathering herself. But she also carried something else: hope. She believed that one day the galaxy would be different, that no species would ever again be treated as prey, that mortality would be seen not as weakness, but as the fire that makes us who we are. She looked out at the gathered crowd, at beings of crystal and shadow and flesh and light. "We proved her right," she said. "All of us together. We showed the galaxy that the brief and the eternal are equals. We showed the galaxy that endings are not tragedies, but teachers. We showed the galaxy what my great-grandmother always knew." Her voice rose, carrying across the silent assembly, that those who know they will die are the ones who truly know how to live. The applause that followed was not loud. It did not need to be. Every being present understood the truth of those words in their own way. The former immortals felt it as a new discovery, a revelation that came with their newfound mortality. The humans felt it as an old friend, a knowledge that had been with them since the first of their species had looked up at the stars and wondered how much time they had. Tessira stood in the crowd and felt something she had never experienced before: peace. Not the peace of endless existence, but the peace of understanding. She would die someday. Everyone she loved would die. Everything she built would eventually crumble. And that was okay. That was more than okay. That was the point. The galaxy turned, as it always had and always would. Stars were born and died. Species rose and fell. But the lesson humanity had taught would echo through the ages, carried forward by those who understood its meaning. Never again would immortals rule through fear. Never again would mortal species bow before eternal tyrants. And never again would beings mistake endless existence for true life. The mortals had won, not by becoming immortal themselves, but by showing the galaxy that mortality was never the weakness the ancients believed it to be. It was the gift that made everything else possible. And in the end, that made all the difference.